Hi, I'm Scott Leadingham. Thanks for joining us here in the unique Northwest. Election season is upon us. Whether or not we are ready, ballots are in the mail. Many people have returned them. Debates have taken place, and all is left but the counting. And here to join us to talk about some of the dynamics in Washington State is Olympia correspondent Austin Jenkins. Thanks for joining us today, Austin.
Good to see you again, Scott.
So, final throws here, the last couple of days before the actual election day, and things are posted. Tell us some of the dynamics in the very close statewide race for governor. What's been going on there?
Yeah, this is, I've been describing it as sort of a lopsided race because you've got incumbent Democrat Jay Inslee seeking a third term. He is someone who ran for president. He's well known in the state, and he's up against a first-time challenger in Republican Lauren Culp from Republic Washington. You know, what's interesting is that Culp has really inspired a base of conservatives to rally to his cause and to his campaign. And there are yard signs and freeway signs for him all over the state. But, you know, does that translate to 40%, 45% of the vote? Could he pull out an upset win? That seems highly unlikely at this point. But nonetheless, it's possible, and this is something I'll be watching for, that he could actually perform better than the Republican candidate Bill Bryant 4 years ago. And that could be for two reasons. One, support for Inslee may be softer than it was 4 years ago, and Culp really has galvanized a base of supporters who are very likely to turn out for him.
So in another statewide race, just below the governor, the lieutenant governor, of course, normally that doesn't attract a whole lot of attention just because it's not as high profile an office. And frankly, probably a lot of people don't even realize we have a lieutenant governor nor what that position does. But this year, there's a little more intrigue. First of all, of course, two Democrats are on the ballot for the general election because of just how the primary system works in Washington State. Both made it through who are Democrats. But second of all, there's this sort of, chain of palace intrigue of possibilities if Joe Biden is elected, and if Jay Inslee is reelected as governor, and if he might be tapped for a potential spot in a Biden administration. That sort of sets up this idea, well, the lieutenant governor is actually now very relevant because they would take the place of a departing governor. So is that some of the dynamics that you're looking at in this race?
I think it certainly adds some intrigue to this race that perhaps wasn't there in past years. Those are, as you note, a lot of ifs. The governor, as recently as last week, told me he's not angling for a job in a future Biden administration should Joe Biden be elected president. Of course, that can always change. But it's also important to note that the lieutenant governor would only serve as acting governor until the next election, presuming there was a shuffle and it happened in the early part of 2021. So does it raise the stakes in this race? Perhaps. Is there a little bit more intrigue? Yes. How realistic is this scenario that's been laid out? I don't know. At this point, I'm not putting a whole lot of stock in it. But it certainly is being talked about, and perhaps is an additional factor in this race. Whether the two candidates are going to try to burnish their credentials and try to show voters that somehow they would be the better acting governor, I don't know that there's a lot of purpose for either of them or advantage in trying to spend a lot of time on that, as much as it might be more advantageous to talk about what they do as lieutenant governor as opposed to acting governor.
Another race that is of interest, maybe that one that doesn't usually draw as much statewide speculation or statewide interest, that is the superintendent of public instruction. Of course, though, everyone has some sort of interest or connection to schools and education, so it certainly is a very important position. But this year, of course, with coronavirus lockdowns and school issues going on there, that sort of raises the level. So what are some of the dynamics there you've been watching in the race between Chris Rakedahl and Maya Espinoza?
Yeah, this is the one nonpartisan statewide race, although Rakedahl's a former Democratic state lawmaker and Espinoza previously ran unsuccessfully as a Republican for the legislature. And what I think got people paying attention, political watchers paying attention to this race, is that Rakedahl performed not super strong in the primary. So that showed vulnerability there. And so this is looking like a competitive race. And as you know, education, I mean, we've got 1 million plus school children in this state. Most of them, the vast majority, are learning remotely right now. So that makes schools and education a front and center topic. You've also got this statewide referendum measure on the new mandatory sex ed policy that passed the legislature earlier this year that's sort of being brought into that race as well. So I think the question becomes, how well is Rakedahl known? Does this race become a referendum on the current state of education in terms of COVID and remote learning? Is sex ed something that galvanizes a group of supporters to come out and not only try to repeal that, but to vote for Espinoza? So many wild cards here, but it definitely makes this race more interesting and more high stakes than you would see in other statewide races where the incumbent is running for re-election and not facing a really strong challenge.
And perhaps we saved the best topic or the most controversial for last. $30 card tabs, of course. Everyone probably has an opinion about that, whether they voted for or against that measure last year. Well, of course, the Supreme Court of Washington State recently overturned it, said it was unconstitutional how it was worded on the ballot. Now, this has, of course, become an issue before in previous years when another initiative went before them and they also ruled it unconstitutional. However, is this the last say that we will ever hear about $30 car tabs, or do you think it'll be an issue going forward in the next legislative session?
There is a Groundhog Day element to this. And, by writing initiatives that then get overturned on $30 car tabs, initiative sponsor Tim Eyman has an issue that never goes away, right? So he can easily bring back another initiative on the same topic and run it again. Who knows if he'll do that, but if passed his prologue, I wouldn't be surprised. Now, that said, the legislature has had ample opportunity over the last several years to address the fatigue, especially in the central Puget Sound region, over the price of car registration fees, which went up significantly because of the Sound Transit Light Rail project. Mind you, voter approved expansion of that project. But I think from the governor on down, what you're hearing in response to that ruling is that, yes, the conversation can continue into the legislative session. Now, the challenge is if you're going to reduce car tabs, you are reducing transportation funding. And that means then there's less money to do projects. So what's that balance point, especially at a time when some in the legislature are talking about a new transportation package? Now, of course, that would come with a new funding source, but that might, that would inevitably raise taxes. So how they figure this out, I don't know, but I do think that there is some perhaps growing sensitivity to the fact that if you're paying $200 or $300 to renew your tabs, for working people, that's a lot of money and builds a lot of frustration. As soon as it becomes a political liability for Democrats who are in control here, they're likely to act. Maybe we haven't reached that tipping point. Maybe we have.
All right, now here's the philosophical question. You've been around for a long time covering statewide politics in the legislature, and I think it's sort of cliche to say this is the most important election of our lifetimes. We hear that so often in almost every election cycle, but then people say, well, no, this year it's particularly true. And I wonder, from your perspective, is this election year, especially particularly in Washington State in the Northwest, in any way different or in any way unique for the leaders, the residents, or is it really just the same issues, different year?
Yeah, no, I don't. I think this is a unique year. Just the voter interest alone makes it different. The rate of ballot returns at this point are far exceeding where we were in 2016. I think 5 times more ballots have been returned in King County by now as compared to 4 years ago at this time, 3 times as many in Pierce County. So tremendous interest on the part of voters, anticipating record turnout, perhaps upwards of 90%. And this isn't just Democrats who are galvanized. People across the spectrum are galvanized right now. So we're seeing tremendous voter interest. And then we're also, it's just a weird year. We haven't seen traditional campaigning. We've seen virtual campaigning. We've seen the contrast in the governor's race of the governor virtually campaigning and and this is sort of the big exception to virtual campaigning, is Lauren Culp out there holding rallies in defiance of and in direct contrast to the governor. So we've seen those kinds of contrasts. It's an interesting year because we don't have any statewide initiative to the people on the ballot for the first time in a presidential year since 1928. So that makes this a unique year. So a lot of things are arranging themselves for us. I think we'll be looking back, and this won't be one that just blurs in with all the other election years, that this will be one we remember in many ways.
It certainly is sometimes a blur, but this one does stand out, and you are there to report on it all. Thanks for joining us today, Austin.
You're welcome, and thanks for having me.
See more of Austin's election year coverage at our website, nwpb.org. And while there, you can check out the Vote 2020 page and remind yourself to watch our election night special, 9 p.m. on Tuesday, November 3rd. Thank you for joining us here in the unique Northwest.